The story you're about to hear is not just about geopolitics, it's about audacity, strategy, and a moment that reshaped Africa's path to independence. When France froze over $327 million in financial assets belonging to Burkina Faso, they believed their former colony would break, brought to its knees, desperate and compliant. But what happened next? It stunned Europe, ignited Africa, and rewrote the rules of post-colonial power. Because Ibrahim Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't fold. He fought back, and in doing so, turned France's greatest weapon into its greatest weakness. This is not a story about what France did. It's a story about what happened in the 48 minutes after. About a quiet decision made in a dusty government office in Ouagadougou. A decision that would send tremors through Paris, London, and Brussels. At exactly 9:17 a.m. on a Monday morning, a confidential communiqué left the French Ministry of Finance. It was short, just 3 lines, but its impact? Devastating. All financial assets linked to the Burkina Faso Central Reserve are to be immediately frozen pending diplomatic clarification. Deceptively diplomatic. Undeniably hostile. Within half an hour, the damage was visible. Bank transfers failed. Government programs lost funding. Medical imports, fuel shipments, and agricultural contracts were all halted. Over $327 million. Gone. As if it had never existed. To French officials, this was chess at grandmaster level. Silent, strategic, clean. No tanks, no headlines, no sanctions to justify. Just the quiet choke of financial warfare. Their prediction? Ibrahim Traoré, cut off from his nation's lifeline, unable to pay his military or sustain basic services, would be forced to surrender, to crawl back and negotiate. But they'd misjudged him. Badly. They saw just another African leader, stuck in the old game, dependent on colonial systems. What they didn't see, what they failed to understand, is that Ibrahim Traoré was building a new playbook. In a quiet room inside the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, bare walls, no gold trim, just steel resolve, Traoré sat with his closest advisors. No one spoke. The only sound was the city outside, unaware their country had just been thrown into economic chaos. Traoré stared at a tablet, watching the data pour in. Frozen accounts, blocked payments, a digital war waged from afar, and then, after a long silence, his chief economic advisor finally spoke. "Mr. President, we can't pay fuel subsidies after Wednesday. The transport sector will shut down," the advisor warned, his voice tight with dread. "Our IMF buffer funds will be out of reach. Creditors will call in loans we can't repay. By next month, we won't be able to pay salaries. Military, teachers, healthcare workers, none of them. That kind of collapse invites unrest. Mutiny, a coup. We need to negotiate with Paris, give them something, anything, in exchange for unfreezing our assets." His words hit the room like a funeral bell. Everyone understood the weight of what was coming. No access to reserves meant the state would suffocate. The French hadn't just frozen funds, they had struck at the very engine of modern governance, liquidity. In a connected world, the ability to move money is survival. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't respond with panic. He didn't shout. He didn't call for diplomats. He asked one question, calm, precise. "Who owns our gold mines?" Silence, the kind that turns rooms into tombs. To some, the question seemed misplaced, irrelevant even. What use was buried gold when bank accounts were frozen? What power did natural resources hold against a financial system designed to keep former colonies in check? But then, slowly, the realization crept in. Traoré wasn't asking about symbolism. He was pointing at leverage. He stood, slow, deliberate, composed, and with a voice like flint meeting steel, he declared, "They've frozen our virtual wealth. Let's remind them of our real wealth." What followed would become legend. The next morning, the nation expected a formal presidential address from behind a polished podium. Instead, their screens flickered to life, revealing a scene never before witnessed in African politics. There stood Ibrahim Traoré, deep underground, inside one of Burkina Faso's largest gold mines. No suit, no teleprompter. Just a hard hat, dusty work clothes, and a silent resolve that said more than any speech ever could. Behind him, real miners moved with purpose. No staging, no filters, just the raw heartbeat of the nation. And when he spoke, it wasn't with bluster. It was with clarity. "They have taken what is ours. On paper," he began, his voice echoing through rock and steel. "But we are reclaiming what is ours, in the ground." Effective immediately, he announced, all foreign mining licenses were suspended. Every ounce of gold, every gram of manganese, every barrel of oil. From that moment forward, it would all be tracked, audited, and claimed for the people of Burkina Faso. "Our country," he said, "is not for sale to the highest bidder." It was unprecedented. No apologies, no petitions, no soft words crafted to ease European ears. Just one man, standing on the very soil that had been extracted for centuries, declaring an end to passive exploitation. And he wasn't done. The cameras kept rolling as Traoré walked deeper into the mine, past machines worth millions, past workers who nodded in respect. He stopped beside a conveyor belt still coated in gold dust and said, "For years we've let them take our gold and give us paper in return. They told us that paper meant stability, that reserves in foreign banks meant security. But now we've seen the truth. That paper vanishes at a keystroke. But this," he held up a piece of raw ore, "this is ours. They cannot freeze this. They cannot take this. Let them keep their paper," he continued. "We will build our future on something real." The video went viral, across Africa, across the world. TikTok exploded with recreations of his speech. Twitter threads dissected every word. Instagram lit up with images of Traoré in his miner's gear, hailed as a symbol of a new African defiance. Hashtags like Real Gold, Shugtroi Challenge, and Burkinazing surged. For 72 hours, Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just a national leader, he was a movement. But that speech, that mine, it was just the opening act. While global media marveled at the symbolism, something deeper was taking place. France had made a calculated chess move. But Traoré wasn't playing chess. He was playing Go, a game of territory, patience, and long-term control. 48 hours after his mine shaft broadcast, the French ambassador, an old hand in African diplomacy, requested an emergency audience. Paris had authorized a face-saving offer, partial asset unfreezing in exchange for guarantees to protect foreign mining interests. But when he arrived at the palace, he was told something shocking. The president wasn't there. In fact, he wasn't even in Burkina Faso. Without any fanfare, Traoré had flown, quietly, strategically, to Bamako, Mali. It wasn't just a courtesy call. Within 24 hours, European intelligence services confirmed what Paris feared most. Traoré had convened a trilateral summit with Mali and Niger, two other nations scarred by French interference and now seeking a new future. Not one voice. Three. 3 nations, 3 armies, one shared agenda. What France had dismissed as a financial squeeze had just triggered a geopolitical earthquake. The meeting didn't take place in a sterile summit hall lined with foreign flags. It happened in a simple conference room overlooking the vibrant markets of Bamako. Outside, the rhythm of trade pulsed through the streets, merchants calling out prices, children weaving through stalls, the smell of grilled maize in the air. It was the sound of Africa, the real Africa. Uncolonized, unfiltered, unapologetic. That setting wasn't an accident. It was a message. 3 heads of state, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, gathering not under foreign sponsorship, but under their own terms, in the heart of their own commerce. Not in Brussels, not in Paris, in Bamako. What they signed that day would later be dubbed the SEO Agreement by the Financial Times, named after Seo Terra of Guinea, the anti-colonial hero who once chose poverty over submission. But unlike Seo Terra's defiant symbolism, this agreement wasn't about defiance. It was about infrastructure, real power, permanent change. At its core, the SEO agreement created a trilateral economic shield, a strategic pact unlike anything seen before in post-colonial Africa. Gold reserves would be pooled and physically shared across secure vaults in all three countries. Trade between them would be backed by barter-based systems tied to natural resources, not vulnerable Western currencies. And a regional emergency bank, fully independent of Europe, would be built to sustain at least 6 months of government operations for all three nations. But the most revolutionary clause? Transparency. Every gram of gold, every trade transaction, every state-level financial movement would be logged on an open-source blockchain accessible by any citizen of any of the three countries. This wasn't just sovereignty. It was economic democracy. France had tried to choke one nation. Instead, they'd catalyzed the birth of the most transparent and independent economic alliance in African history. 3 Sahel nations, rich in gold, uranium, and rare earth minerals, now stood linked, building a financial architecture that could withstand the pressures of foreign manipulation and create a blueprint for the entire continent. The shockwaves were immediate. European mining companies, long accustomed to cheap access and weak oversight, saw their stock prices nosedive as markets began to digest the real implications of unified African control over critical resources. At mining sites, unpaid workers who had initially protested over salaries began organizing larger demonstrations, not just against lost wages, but in support of national control. Placards didn't read, "Pay us." They read, "Let Africa own its future." And for once, the world listened. What international media had first dismissed as a rhetorical stunt quickly revealed itself as something much more serious. The Financial Times called it the SEO Revolution, how 3 African nations may have changed the game forever. The Wall Street Journal devoted its front page to the rise of resource-backed barter systems and the global risks they posed to existing financial hierarchies. Even critics in Europe had to admit this wasn't noise, it was strategy. But the final blow to France's credibility came not from Bamako, but from Paris itself. A leaked intelligence memo, marked confidential diffusion restraint, fell into the hands of international journalists. It was dated 4 weeks before the financial freeze, and what it revealed was damning. The memo outlined a coordinated strategy to manufacture economic instability across the Sahel, aimed not just at punishing Burkina Faso for its independent stance, but at engineering a regional crisis that would drive Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso back into the fold of French economic oversight. It wasn't about terrorism. It wasn't about governance. It was about control. France hadn't just underestimated Traoré. They had miscalculated the entire direction of African political consciousness. Because this time, it wasn't just resistance. It was replacement. And the world was no longer watching Africa through the lens of pity or charity. It was watching with respect and increasingly caution. The leaked memo was clear, chillingly clear. It outlined a strategy of coordinated financial pressure, covert support for opposition groups, and the manipulation of international aid flows, all designed to destabilize Burkina Faso and its Sahel neighbors. The ultimate goal? To engineer chaos that would make renewed French intervention seem not only necessary, but welcomed. The plan was not subtle. And when Al Jazeera broke the story under the headline, "The Neo-Colonial Playbook, How France Planned to Destabilize the Sahel," the fallout was immediate. France's credibility, already eroding, collapsed almost overnight. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. The memo exposed a wider agenda: to preserve French dominance across the Sahel using economic sabotage, political interference, and a well-oiled media narrative. France's European allies, many already uneasy with its legacy of heavy-handedness in Africa, quickly began to distance themselves. What had once been defended as a measured financial response was now nakedly revealed as strategic destabilization in disguise. The global conversation shifted. Suddenly, Ibrahim Traoré's claims of interference, exploitation, and neo-colonial manipulation were no longer accusations. They were facts, documented and undeniable. But while the world rallied to his side, Traoré didn't waste time celebrating. He knew media sympathy was fleeting. Headlines fade. Change, if it is to last, must be built on systems, not sentiment. And so, 10 days after France froze Burkina Faso's assets, with European officials quietly scrambling to walk back their failed strategy, Traoré sat down for an interview. But it wasn't with a foreign news outlet. It wasn't broadcast in French. It wasn't a polished PR production. It was filmed simply, spoken in Moray, his mother tongue, and it aired directly to the people of Burkina Faso. That choice alone was radical. For generations, African politics had been filtered through colonial languages, French, English, Portuguese. But Traoré rejected that script. He spoke to his people in their language, their rhythm, their soul. And what he announced would become known as the most visionary economic proposal in post-colonial African history. Our new regional bank, he said, will not be backed by the euro. It will not be backed by the dollar. It will be backed by our gold, audited not by outsiders, but by our own satellites, our own drones, and our own scientists. This wasn't just symbolism. It was a total rejection of dependency. Where traditional banking systems were plugged into global networks controlled by former colonizers, Traoré was proposing a new financial architecture rooted in physical assets and technological autonomy. And then came the second revelation, a revolutionary concept he called the People's Ledger. "We are digitizing our land," he declared. "Every gram of gold, every mineral, every resource will be tracked, from the moment it leaves the earth to the moment it is spent, and every citizen will have the right to see where it goes." Using blockchain technology, Traoré envisioned a public, tamper-proof database, accessible from any mobile phone, open to all, manipulable by none. It would record exactly what came out of every mine, what revenues it generated, and how those revenues were spent on roads, schools, hospitals, or nothing at all. But Traoré went even further. Each citizen would receive a personal identifier within the ledger, and every 3 months, they would receive a direct dividend from the country's resource income. No political middlemen, no relief funds, just automatic algorithmic justice, a system where the people didn't just own the resources in name, they shared in the profit in real time. At first, the outside world was stunned, skeptical. Silicon Valley analysts dismissed it as utopian PR. But then technical documents leaked, and what they revealed turned heads, from Palo Alto to Zurich. The system wasn't a prototype. It was already in development. The blockchain architecture included multi-node redundancy, real-time audit trails, and biometric verification. It wasn't just visionary, it was viable. Tech blogs that had once ridiculed African cryptocurrency dreams were now asking serious questions. Could a landlocked nation like Burkina Faso, battered by economic warfare, really pioneer the next generation of democratic finance? And the answer, quietly, confidently, was becoming yes. Because Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just responding to a crisis, he was redefining leadership. And through a brutal act of economic aggression, France had accidentally triggered the birth of a new African model, rooted in transparency, sovereignty, and shared prosperity. And the world was watching. The satellite imaging system was revolutionary, using real-time analytics and AI-powered algorithms to monitor mining operations down to the square meter. The citizen interface? Seamless, simple. built to function even on basic smartphones in rural areas with limited internet access. This wasn't future tech. It was present-day empowerment. Soon, headlines around the world took notice. Forbes ran an in-depth analysis titled, "The Blockchain Revolution Africa Didn't See Coming," describing how Burkina Faso's radical transparency model could become a template for resource-rich nations everywhere. TechCrunch praised the People's Ledger as a technical leap, noting that even the most advanced economies had failed to achieve this level of government accountability. Harvard Business Review published a case study that spread through policy circles like wildfire. This wasn't just governance, it was a redesign of the social contract itself. At first, global development agencies scoffed. They assumed it was all political theater, but as the data rolled in, their skepticism dissolved. Behind closed doors, even the World Bank, under quiet pressure from its donor nations, began studying the Burkina model. United Nations officials, off the record, admitted that Traoré had done what no African leader before him had ever accomplished. He had implemented a fully transparent, citizen-accessible, tech-driven system of mineral wealth governance. But the most important proof wasn't in the media. It was in the streets. Within weeks, ordinary Burkinabé were accessing the People's Ledger on their phones. Villagers who had never set foot in a bank could now see in real time how much gold had been extracted from their local mines and where that money was being spent. School projects, clinics, water systems. For the first time in their nation's history, the people could see the wealth beneath their feet reflected in the progress around them. France hadn't just failed to break Traoré. They had inadvertently triggered the creation of the most transparent natural resource economy the world had ever seen. What was meant to be a punishment had become a revolution. The reversal from Paris was swift and humiliating. There was no press conference, no handshake, no formal communique. One morning, Burkina Faso's blocked accounts were suddenly active. Transactions resumed, frozen assets thawed. International payment systems flickered back online as if nothing had ever happened. When asked for comment, French officials gave short, bureaucratic answers about constructive dialogue and improved diplomatic engagement. But there was no apology, no justification, no acknowledgement that their policy had failed spectacularly. Their silence said everything. For decades, France had wielded financial warfare as a way to maintain dominance over its former colonies. But now, that weapon had not only misfired, it had empowered the very movement it was meant to destroy. And at the center of it all stood Ibrahim Traoré, no longer just a transitional head of state, but a global icon. The requests flooded in. The African Union invited him to deliver the keynote address at its next summit. The BRICS Plus nations, eager to decouple from Western economic dominance, asked him to attend their Economic Development Forum. Universities from Harvard to Oxford to the London School of Economics reached out, not for symbolic appearances, but for serious policy lectures. They weren't inviting Traoré as a ceremonial figurehead. They were inviting him as an architect of the future. And when he stood before the African Union, facing leaders who, like him, had battled the chains of post-colonial dependency, his message was unmistakable. "For too long," he began, "we have accepted our place as exporters of raw materials and importers of finished goods, buying back our own resources at 10 times their value. For too long, we have allowed our wealth to flow through foreign financial systems governed by rules we did not write. And for too long, we have been told that this arrangement is natural, inevitable, permanent." He paused. Across the hall, heads of state nodded, some slowly, some reluctantly, but all knowingly. But nothing is permanent except the courage to change. We hold the resources the world needs. We hold the creativity and human capital to build something better. And now, we have the tools. "The question is not whether we can achieve independence," he said, his voice rising. "The question is whether we are ready to seize it." The room erupted, not in polite applause, but in something deeper, urgent. historic. Traoré wasn't offering abstract dreams or recycled Pan-African slogans. He was offering a working system, a blueprint. And behind the scenes, leaders lined up to ask him, "Can you help us do the same?" Mining companies, once comfortable in the shadows of opaque extraction deals, suddenly found themselves under a new spotlight, facing demands for transparency from governments that, just months before, had been passive bystanders. Within 6 months of the SECO agreement, the ripple effects were unmistakable. Ghana announced plans to implement a version of the People's Ledger for its gold sector. Nigeria began developing a blockchain-based system to track oil revenues. The Democratic Republic of Congo opened regional talks to establish a cobalt transparency network, a potential game-changer for the global tech supply chain. What began as a bold defiance of financial warfare was fast becoming a continental movement, a wave of resource sovereignty and economic justice sweeping across Africa. But this transformation didn't stop at the government level. Civil society caught fire. Students marched with banners that read, "Our land, our ledger." Activists demanded real-time access to revenue data. Community leaders and traditional rulers, long excluded from decisions involving the wealth beneath their own feet, began asserting their right to sit at the negotiating table, not just as symbols, but as stakeholders. The BRICS Plus conference revealed just how far Traoré's message had traveled. Before an audience of leaders from China, Russia, India, and Brazil, nations with their own complicated histories with Western financial institutions, Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward not just as a regional leader, but as a global thinker. "We have proven," he told the crowd, "that a financial system can be built on verified physical wealth, not fiat currencies designed for political manipulation. We've shown that technology can deliver transparency beyond what even the most developed nations have achieved. Economic independence is no longer a dream, it is a system, and it works." The implications were enormous. If resource-rich nations could follow this model, they would no longer need to bow to the terms of Western banks or negotiate under threat of economic punishment. They could set their own prices, enforce their own contracts, and build economies grounded in accountability, not dependence. Behind the scenes, the tectonic shifts had already begun. Chinese diplomats discreetly requested briefings on SECO's structure, seeing potential applications for Belt and Road Initiative partnerships. Russian energy firms, frustrated by Western sanctions, expressed keen interest in resource-backed trade systems immune to dollar-based restrictions. Indian blockchain firms offered to help other African nations replicate the People's Ledger infrastructure. Even Silicon Valley was watching closely. The European Union, meanwhile, was left scrambling, caught off guard by a rapidly changing geopolitical reality. Development aid programs, once central to their soft power playbook, now looked outdated compared to Burkina Faso's transparent resource dividend model. European mining giants, used to extracting wealth through sweetheart deals, now faced a united front. 3 Sahelian nations, sharing gold reserves, tracking every gram of resource movement, and making that data publicly accessible in real time. But the most profound shift wasn't in policy or trade. It was in perception. For decades, African leadership was viewed by the global North through a lens of crisis management, not innovation. Traoré shattered that image. He wasn't begging for aid. He wasn't asking for debt relief. He was building a better system, and the world had no choice but to take it seriously. In less than 90 days, he had gone from defending his country against a financial ambush to becoming a global symbol of visionary leadership. France's attempt to break Burkina Faso's resistance had backfired on a historic scale, elevating Traoré's ideas to a world stage no diplomatic speech could have achieved. The story of Burkina Faso was no longer just a political case study. It was a template, a blueprint for small nations with big resources and bigger dreams, and the lessons extended well beyond Africa. They spoke to every developing nation navigating a global system designed to keep them subservient. They proved that with courage, strategy, and innovation, even the smallest players could change the rules of the game. What made the story unforgettable wasn't just its triumph, it was how the triumph was achieved. France had every advantage: global banks, legacy networks, decades of colonial infrastructure. But none of that could compete with a leader who dared to build something new. And in a quiet conversation at the presidential residence, a visiting venture capitalist from San Francisco put it plainly. "We've spent decades trying to solve the problem of trust in digital systems. We built blockchains for cryptocurrency, for contracts, for supply chains. But we never thought to apply that same tech to something so human, so real, as natural resource governance. You didn't just solve the problem, you made it work." The numbers spoke for themselves. In less than a year, the People's Ledger processed over 50,000 transactions, tracked 2.3 tons of gold, and delivered quarterly dividends to over 8 million Burkina Faso citizens. Automatically, without middlemen, without corruption, and without compromise. It was no longer just theory, it was proof. And the world could never unsee it. Despite being deployed in a country with limited technological infrastructure, the system achieved an astonishing 99.7% uptime. Citizen surveys revealed over 85% approval for the transparency initiatives, an unheard-of figure in a region where trust in government had long been fractured. But it wasn't just Burkina Faso that felt the ripple. The visit from Silicon Valley technologists had been more than symbolic. Within weeks of returning to California, several top executives began quietly overhauling their internal systems, inspired not by Wall Street, but by Ouagadougou. Decades-old financial silos were dismantled. Employee dashboards now displayed real-time internal financial flows. Resource use data, once closely guarded, was now visible to employees, shareholders, and the public alike. At first, markets flinched. Investors, trained to trust secrecy, worried about overexposure. But something unexpected happened. Transparency became an asset. Stock prices rose. Agricultural exports, textile manufacturing, tourism revenue, all came under the banner of a new ethic: radical accountability. And where African nations once undercut each other for foreign investment, they now coordinated policies, not to compete, but to protect. The era of quiet extraction had ended. The continent was no longer for sale. France, the architect of the original financial freeze, found itself scrambling. Publicly, French leaders praised the innovation and governance reforms sweeping through the Sahel and beyond. Macron's successors spoke loftily of partnership and co-development, but privately, French corporations and intelligence services were floundering. Mining profits shrank, squeezed by fair pricing algorithms and transparent royalties. French banks, once central to Africa's resource flows, were locked out of new regional financial systems. Intelligence services, desperate to reassert influence, launched digital sabotage campaigns, hiring hackers to find cracks in the People's Ledger, funding opposition groups that claimed transparency threatened business privacy. But the architecture they sought to undermine had no central hub to attack. Every ledger node was distributed. Every citizen was a watchdog. Every failure to breach the system only proved its resilience. Covert operations that might once have succeeded were now impossible to conceal. The people were watching, and they understood how to verify truth for themselves. 3 years after those fateful 48 minutes in the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré stood once again in the same unadorned room. But this time, he wasn't alone. Seated around the table were the presidents of 12 African nations, CEOs of major tech companies, international development leaders, and grassroots civil society figures. They were there to sign what the world would come to know as the Ouagadougou Accords, a binding framework for implementing transparent, citizen-led resource governance across the global South. It was the moment the world formally acknowledged what had quietly begun in the shadows of a crisis. A new architecture of independence, one not based on ideology or aid, but on technology, equity, and trust. The accords weren't just African. Latin American nations joined to apply the model to lithium and rare earths. Pacific Island states used it to defend their fisheries. Even Nordic countries signed on, seeking to pilot dividend-based citizen wealth systems. As Traoré signed the document, he paused, remembering the quiet question that had changed everything. Who owns our gold mines? That simple inquiry had exploded into something far larger, a demand for system-wide accountability. Not just who owns resources, but who controls the systems through which nations grow, trade, and govern. And now the answer was clear. The people do. Given tools, given truth, given trust. What made this revolution truly historic wasn't its scale or even its success, it was its sustainability. No foreign donors propped it up, no consultants were needed to explain it. No outside validation was required. The movement funded itself, trained its own leaders, and built momentum from the ground up, fueled by citizens who refused to remain silent. As the signing ceremony ended and leaders returned to their countries with plans to launch their own people's ledgers, Traoré understood that this moment was no longer his. The revolution had outgrown him. It now belonged to every farmer who could trace their land's value, every miner who could see where royalties were spent, every student who could track public funds used for their school. The 48-minute conversation that began as a desperate response to foreign financial warfare had blossomed into a blueprint for sovereignty in the 21st century. And somewhere out there, in another small nation on the brink, someone was watching. Their story would begin soon. Because the revolution wasn't over. It was just the beginning.